Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
The Noble Mind podcast is brought to you by the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy. Hello, I'm Alex Gökçe.
And I'm Dr. Kate King. In this episode, we talk to Dr. Christopher Germer about self-compassion, its relationship to shame, how to establish a meditation practice, Bhakti yoga, and more.
Dr. Germer is a clinical psychologist and lecturer at Harvard Medical School. He is a co-developer of the Mindful Self-Compassion program, which has been taught to over 50,000 people around the globe.
He is the author of The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion and co-author of Teaching the Mindful Self-Compassion program and the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook.
Dr. Germer is a founding faculty member of the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy, as well as the Center for Mindfulness and Compassion at Harvard Medical School. He teaches and leads workshops internationally and has a private practice in Massachusetts, specializing in mindfulness and compassion-based psychotherapy.
You can find more information about Chris's work at chrisgermer.com and centerformsc.org. We hope you enjoy the show, and don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and stay in touch on social media. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Noble Mind Podcast. You can also get our show notes at noblemindpodcast.com.
Thank you very much for joining us. We are both delighted that we can spend time with you and learn from you. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your interest in self-compassion?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm delighted to be here. I've been interested in self-compassion now since 2006, so that's 13 years. And the interest really arose out of my interest in mindfulness, which I'd been practicing for a long time. I first learned mindfulness in a cave in Sri Lanka when I was 25, and now I'm 66. So it's been a while. But I'm a therapist, and I always felt that as we were practicing mindfulness, that there was something missing when it came to therapy, because therapy is very relational, and it's full of warmth and empathy and compassion and so forth. And I always had the sense that if we focused mostly on attention and how we allocate our attention, rather than the qualities of mindfulness, which are loving kindness and compassion, joy, equanimity. So I always thought if we didn't include those aspects, those, what we might say, heart qualities of mindfulness explicitly, that something was missing in the transition to psychotherapy. So, but the irony was that personally, as I practiced, I really preferred more of the attention and spaciousness aspects of mindfulness. But it was only when I had a personal problem that I basically could not properly address in the way that I'd been practicing, that it really forced me to look at the other side of things. And that really ultimately brought together the hard qualities of mindfulness with the practice of mindfulness in psychotherapy. And what basically had happened was, throughout my entire professional career, I had fear of public speaking anxiety. It was really, really hard for me to speak in front of an audience. I could always do workshops, but I couldn't do lectures. I would tremble. I would be miserable for weeks in advance. I couldn't think. Once I was about to give a talk to therapists along with the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy in Santa Fe. There were maybe about 50 therapists. And there was a guy in the corner of the room who yelled out because I couldn't speak. He said, "Take a breath."
Oh, no.
So I went through quite a few humbling times.
Well,
However,
I think most of the world can relate to you, I think, the public speaking fear.
Yeah, Jerry Seinfeld made a joke. He said that fear of public speaking is
even greater than the fear of death. That means that if you were at a funeral, you would rather be in the box than delivering the eulogy.
That's about right, I think.
That's about right. Yeah. Anyhow, so as a talk was coming up at Harvard Medical School, where colleagues from the Institute and I put together this conference along with Cambridge Health Alliance, and I would, when I knew I'd have to speak, I became more and more petrified, and then I went on a mindfulness and loving kindness meditation retreat, and really for the first time started practicing loving kindness meditation for real. This was in 2006, and then also afterwards in my personal meditation practice, and it made all the difference. I write about this in books and things, so it gets a little. Maybe people who are listening have already read it, don't want to bore them. The actual mechanics of the thing, but what I can say is that when you practice loving kindness meditation, it creates a new voice in the head. It's no longer the voice of, everybody's going to think you're a fool or a fraud or stupid. This critical stuff, this harsh voice. When you practice loving kindness meditation, a new voice occurs, an encouraging voice, like, oh, may you be safe, may you be peaceful. And if you're trying to do something really scary, and you have a dear friend who's near you talking in a kind way, it's very emboldening. This is essentially what psychotherapists do for their clients in large respect. And with self-compassion practice, in this case through loving kindness meditation, I got this new voice which supported me at that conference, and I really haven't had much fear since then. But what it did was totally change my view of mindfulness and psychotherapy. In other words, now it's really mindfulness and self-compassion in psychotherapy. And I think that combination dovetails much better with the relational practice of psychotherapy than looking at mindfulness primarily through the lens of attention.
So I have to go back to your cave in Sri Lanka comment. If you don't mind talking a little bit about how you ended up in a cave in Sri Lanka at 25, I would love, that sounds like there's a story there. If you're willing to share anything.
Well, that was 1977, and there were a lot of young people like me going to caves. 1977, I kind of,
the thing to do.
It was the thing to do. I went overland from Europe to India. Back in those days, you could go right through Iran and Afghanistan and Pakistan. They were all safe, and the borders were open, and it was the hippie path basically to India, and I did that. But prior to that, I had learned transcendental meditation, and I had a profound experience, what you call a peak experience, where there was no self, there was radiant light in all directions. It was amazing, and I didn't really have anybody I could talk with about that, and that's why I went to India. And I spent a year in India, traveling the length and breadth of India, talking to saints and sages, and basically learning about meditation and Indian culture and spirituality. And in the context of that, I went to Sri Lanka. But that experience I had on TM has basically shaped my life in terms of getting me started in that direction. And then at the end of that year, I was completely convinced that Western psychology, which in those days was mostly psychoanalysis, beginning of cognitive behavior therapy, and a whole lot of humanistic psychology, that what we were doing was at the time, I felt pretty trivial compared to the depth of understanding of psychology in the contemplative practice tradition of India. And so I pretty much dedicated my life since then to integrating contemplative wisdom with Western psychology. Not so much intentionally, but because it's just been profoundly interesting and important to me personally.
Mm-hmm.
So was part of what you sensed when relating to Hindu and Buddhist teachers that there was also an element of compassion in addition to their good attention that was sort of being missed?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for saying that, Alex. Actually, to be honest, in those days, even though I learned mindfulness meditation in Sri Lanka, I was really more taken by the Bhakti tradition in India, which is the devotional tradition. Basically, seeing God and serving God in all beings. That's the essence of it. It's a love path, a path of love and devotion, and there's just some extraordinary people in India now, and they've always been, who have become liberated through heart practice like this, like I described, and I was really quite taken by that at the time as well. And so since then, I've pretty much integrated both the mindfulness side of things and also the compassion side of things. But I really didn't, I guess in the Tibetan tradition, that combination occurs more explicitly than in other traditions. But I don't know, I just didn't find my way in the West in this integration. So that only happened later when I discovered self-compassion. So now at 66, I really feel like in some respects there's a kind of a integration or harmony occurring between the wisdom side of things, the compassion side of things, the psychotherapy side of things. And frankly, in the West, we really have an opportunity to do that because it's also new. We haven't gotten rigidified in certain cultural norms about, I mean, definitely we are becoming tribal, like there's the mindfulness tribe and there's the compassion tribe, but we're not that tribal yet, so I'm hoping that we can forge on the foundation of science and integration, which was really not available for me in those days.
For those who are new to the idea, how would you describe self-compassion and mindful self-compassion and its importance?
Well, so first of all, compassion, we all kind of know what compassion is. There are different components to compassion. There's the ability to recognize suffering, to feel for the suffering, in other words, empathy, to wish that it were otherwise, an intention, as well as an action component, which is to do something. So compassion for others is kind of seeing, feeling, wishing, and doing. And self-compassion is the same toward yourself. And that's actually not so easy to do because we're so close to ourselves. In the same way we often save our harshest treatment for those who are nearest and dearest to us, we are very near and dear to ourselves, and we're not necessarily so nice to ourselves. But essentially, in a you might say informal way, self-compassion is treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding as we would treat someone we truly love or genuinely care about. And Kristen Neff, my colleague since 2008, operationally defined self-compassion in 2003 and made a scale, self-compassion scale, which is used in most of the research. And her definition of self-compassion has three components. One is mindfulness, or knowing what we're experiencing while we're experiencing it. The second is common humanity, the sense of I'm not alone, that it's a sort of that as human beings, we are more alike than not alike. And the third component is self-kindness, so this quality of warmth. So those three components, mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness, together are what we call self-compassion.
And I think that scale is available online. So I think I'll share it in our show notes so that people can have a look at it. And I remember I've taken it at some point myself. So if people sort of look at the items on those scales and those three different dimensions of mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness, and they see that maybe they're doing really well in one of those areas, but maybe not so much in one of the others, what would somebody maybe do next if they notice maybe, one of those areas? You could pick any one or go through all three. I don't know, that they need a little help or support in those different aspects of self-compassion.
Yeah, that's a great question. So usually, what we're interested in when it comes to the scale is the total score.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, how all those three combine.
Mm-hmm.
But if you find, for example, that you're not very mindful, you can basically learn mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
If you find that you don't have a lot of sense of common humanity, in other words, feel kind of isolated, I would recommend that that one practices, for starters, compassion for others, especially the practice just like me. In other words, you can walk down the street, you see somebody, you say, just like me. You see another person, I say, just like me. Just like me, this person gets sad. Just like me, this person is happy. Just like me, this person suffers pain. And so that's a way of growing in common humanity. And self-kindness, that's that's the trickiest one, actually.
So too,
and
yeah.
there's so much resistance that we have to kindness based on the ways that we've been wounded in the past in relationships, starting from birth, really. And for that purpose, and actually to, you might say, enhance all these three qualities of self-compassion, Kristen Neff and I created the Mindful Self-Compassion Training Program back in 2010, and a person can take that program. It's been really carefully refined over the last 10 years, and kind of scaffolded so that each practice and each teaching builds on the other. And usually by the time the 8-week program is over, 8 weeks times 2 3/4 hours, people get it. People feel an internal shift and know what self-compassion feels like, and they know how to bring it into their daily lives. So yeah, it's to learn self-compassion is swimming upstream. We need help. We need help, which means good to do it with others in a group, and we also need technology and information how to go about it, and that's why we made that program.
It'd be great to hear a little bit more about the sort of trajectory through the program for people when they sign up to do it, or work through it with a clinician. What would be in store for them?
Yeah, so first of all, we have teachers all over the world, and you don't need to be a clinician to teach this program.
Mm-hmm.
You need to have gone through a teacher training pathway and have certain prerequisites, but you don't have to be a clinician. And it's usually done in a group, as you said. The sessions are 2 3/4 hours long, and it takes place over 8 weeks, one day per week. And there's also a 4-hour retreat where we're mostly in silence. People practice the different practices. So the program it's quite, you might say, dense. There are 34 different topics. There are 3 core meditations. There are 4 other meditations. There are 20 informal practices. There are 14 class exercises. There's a lot going on, but the reason why there's so much diversity in the program is because everyone's different, and we advise people and encourage people and guide people as they go through it to see what practices speak to them the most. In other words, what is easiest, what is most pleasant, as well as meaningful. And so the different sessions, the first session is an introduction to self-compassion. The second is on mindfulness, particularly learning how to anchor our awareness in the present moment when in the midst of emotional turmoil. That's really key, that anchoring function of mindfulness, because self-compassion can be quite emotionally activating. So we like to create a foundation right off. And we also explain why self-compassion is activating and help people to stay in what we call the challenge zone rather than getting overwhelmed or bored. And then the third part is we learn loving kindness meditation and particularly learn find phrases that speak directly to our own hearts. That's in session 3. Session 4, we build on that, build on the loving intention or the compassionate intention to what we call create a compassionate inner voice, particularly as a way of motivating ourselves with kindness rather than criticism. Session 4 is quite eye-opening for a lot of people. And then session 5, we dive into compassion in relationships, compassionate listening, as well as core values, because the research shows actually that the more we align ourselves with our core values, the more compassionate we are. And the essential self-compassion question is, what do I need? But if we don't know what we need, in other words, we don't know our core values, it's very hard to answer that question. So that's session 5. Session 6, is called meeting difficult emotions, particularly shame. If nothing else, self-compassion is a remarkable antidote to shame. And session 7, working with challenging relationships. I believe we've all had at least one.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's somebody else. You know? Yeah. And in particular, working with anger in relationships. So as you can see, each of these sessions is pretty juicy. And then the last session is on positive psychology, which is the qualities of gratitude, savoring, and self-appreciation. So we like people to leave the course with a smile, and most everybody does.
That's great.
It's quite a transformational
experience.
It
sounds like 8 really intense and profound weeks.
Yeah. You don't want to do this as a retreat, and you definitely don't want to take the MSc course when a person is in the midst of a very stressful period of their lives or a traumatic time, because it is emotionally activating. We need to be able to emotionally regulate ourselves. Mm-hmm. We can't be dysregulated when we start.
Does that speak to the backdraft you write about?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Yeah, backdraft is the central, you might say, mechanism by which self-compassion works, and that is when we give ourselves compassion, we discover the conditions under which we were not treated compassionately. You know, there's a saying, love reveals everything unlike itself. And we see this in therapy too. You know, when therapists are really nice to their clients they feel safe, and then they start to reconnect with all the times in their life they did not feel like that. And often it's traumatic and it comes out, you know. So even therapists need to regulate how kind they are to their clients so that they don't overwhelm their clients with old trauma. And so similarly, when we give ourselves kindness, we need to be very intelligent about how zealously or intensely we practice, because the way that self-compassion works is by, you know, kicking up this old dust and then meeting that with mindfulness and compassion. In other words, it's a reparenting process. We actually can develop a safe haven or a secure base within ourselves by, as adults, being the parent to ourselves that we may have wished we had when we were younger. It's a profound healing process. But we like to say that self-compassion training is therapeutic, but it's not therapy. In other words, it's resource building. We're not trying to heal old wounds. Our focus is not old wounds. We don't have the time and the personal attention. We can't give the personal attention needed to do that. But we build resources, but we also build the resources in what we say slowly, you know. Bill Morgan at the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy likes to say, it's good to become a slow learner.
That's good advice. Right. Yeah, I have spoken with people who, have had difficult childhoods, maybe trauma or just bad parenting. And then when they encounter somebody who's very compassionate or loving, or they try to hear that voice in their head, it's such a contrast to what their past experiences were. It just brings up a deep feeling of sadness and regret for what wasn't given before. And that,
Yes.
like you said, that can be really upsetting and activating for people.
Yes, grief. People feel grief
Yes.
about how they were treated. And people also feel grief about how they treated themselves. Like, I can't believe I've been talking to myself like this for 35 years.
Yes.
So this is all backdraft, and it's an essential part of the healing process. It, but thing to know about backdraft is that it's good, as long as we have the capacity to work with it. That's not too much backdraft. So that's what teachers do. Teachers are taught to be very vigilant about overzealousness, because sometimes somebody will come into this program with trauma or depression or anxiety, and then they say, well, I just need to be more self-compassionate, and they like hunker down and they practice and they practice and they get more and more backdraft, and then they say, oh, it's because I don't have enough self-compassion, and then they get more backdraft, and that's not where we want to go. So we start right in session 2 with backdraft is a fact. The foundation of self-compassion is safety, emotional safety, care for your emotional safety, become a slow learner. We will help you. But the way to do this is slow and easy, the slower we walk, the further we go.
Could you say a little bit more about when you talked about motivating yourself with kindness rather than criticism? Because that, I feel like, touches the heart of, like what you said about how people maybe have treated themselves in the past. And I think that's a struggle I've encountered in talking to people about these ideas. Is there's a belief that if I'm nice to myself, I'm going to just be really soft on myself, and then I won't get anything done.
Yeah, so this is one of what we call the 5 myths of self-compassion, that if I'm kind to myself, I will lose my motivation.
Uh-huh.
And I will remain the same schlub that I currently am for the rest of my life, But ironically, what we find is that people who are high in self-compassion and low in self-compassion have the same high standards. But the difference is that people who are high in self-compassion are actually more motivated to reach their goals, more motivated.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not hard to understand why they have more motivation, and that is they're motivating themselves with encouragement and kindness rather than harsh self-criticism. So imagine, you're, say, on a track team, and you're, out at a practice, and you're really tired, and you've given it your all, and then your coach says, what's the matter with you? I don't even know why you're on the team. Who do you think you are? Get moving. That's not motivating. That's like, screw you, I quit,
Uh-huh.
But if the coach says, every day is not the same in practice, and, you did really great yesterday, and today you probably need a rest. Why don't we go slow today? Just do this and that. And, tomorrow's another day. We'll put this together, that kind of inner coach voice.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine that everything you want to do, say exercising more, or I don't know, doing your taxes on time, whatever you need to motivate yourself to do, you're doing it sympathetically, but also, in a sense, firmly, kindly and firmly. We're just way more likely to improve, and also from the inside out,
Mm-hmm.
And things change, like, for example, for people who would like to eat more in a more nourishing or healthy way, from a self-compassion point of view, what we're really interested in doing is having a conversation with ourselves, in which we might say something like, honey, are you hungry? And then you might say, no, but I'm feeling stressed and I need some comfort. Then the question would be, oh, well, maybe we can get you some comfort. If you're not hungry, maybe you don't want to eat, but you want to feel better. How can we do that? So this is the way a coach would talk to us, not like, I want to eat, shouldn't eat, what's the matter with you, you ate, that kind of nasty conversation, which only perpetuates bad habits,
Such a relatable example. Yeah.
In terms of the Mindful Self-Compassion course, what are the benefits that flow from it? Why is it important? Of course, I'm aware there are probably very wide-ranging effects, but I wonder if you can encapsulate.
Yeah, well, there sure are a lot of benefits to self-compassion. So, for example, the research, there are now like 3,000 articles in the academic literature on self-compassion, and just about every one of them, like 99.5% of them, basically show that self-compassion is an inner resource that's really good for you. So across the board, we find that self-compassion increases well-being, such as things like life satisfaction, happiness, gratitude, self-confidence, optimism, wisdom, curiosity, conscientiousness, creativity, autonomy, emotional competence, emotional intelligence, all kinds of things. And it also decreases anxiety, depression, stress, perfectionism, rumination, shame, suicidality. It's also really good for your health. It improves the immune system. It helps people to eat better, exercise better, drink less alcohol. It makes people get enough sleep, things like that. So self-compassion is an inner resource which basically allows us to live a healthier life. There's a psychologist at Duke University, Mark Leary, who said that the research is boring because self-compassion is associated with just about every measure of well-being, emotional and psychological well-being that we have. So it's really a cost-effective thing to do, you learn self-compassion, and our lives thrive in ways that we might not even have anticipated. Actually, it's changing something very fundamental about who we are.
Yeah, it's such a foundational skill, or such a foundational way of relating to yourself and your own experience, that when that shifts, there isn't another thing that wouldn't be affected by it. It's like the whole climate of your experience changes.
Yeah. And I think that's why there's so much enthusiasm for self-compassion right now.
Mm-hmm. So you've been teaching more recently, it seems like, about shame. You've been thinking about shame lately, or maybe it's always been on your mind on some level, but I've been noticing that there's more discussion of it. So what brought about your interest in this topic of shame? And
well, I think first of all, I think I'm a shame-prone person, and I think I've always been a kind of an anxiety-prone person as well. What I didn't realize is that the shame part was probably behind the anxiety part. So my personal interest began really around that public speaking matter. And one thing that I learned after I practiced loving kindness meditation is that public speaking anxiety is actually not an anxiety disorder. It's a shame disorder. And for years and years, I tried to make room for anxiety, mindfully make room for anxiety. I did all kinds of things. I took beta blockers. I used to run until I was exhausted before I gave a speech. But I was trying to work with anxiety. I didn't actually see the shame behind it. The shame was in the shadows. And after I learned loving kindness meditation, particularly toward oneself in the form of self-compassion, I was able to see the shame. And what I realized is behind the public speaking anxiety was basically a fear that I would be seen by my colleagues as stupid, incompetent, or fraudulent. And this is quite easy to imagine, because if I'm trying to give a talk on mindfulness and I can't even speak because I'm so nervous, clearly I haven't practiced enough, But what I learned was I just had practiced in the wrong way, I needed to basically learn to love myself, So anyhow, shame, a definition of shame, a kind of an operational definition of shame, is I am imagining that you are imagining something about me. And in particular, you're imagining something bad about me, something that I am kind of afraid will render me unlovable. So shame is a social emotion. And So if you go up to give a speech and you're imagining that the audience is thinking you're stupid, incompetent, and fraudulent, how can you possibly speak, you know? And the amazing thing is that once I learned loving kindness meditation and I got up to speak to this group at Harvard, I looked out over the crowd, and usually everyone in the audience was like an enemy to me because they basically were criticizing me in my head, you know, because I was feeling shame, because it was hard to speak. But after I learned this, I looked out at the crowd and everybody looked really beautiful to me. It was the most remarkable thing. I just thought, oh, and then I had the thought, oh, may everybody be safe. May everybody be. I just loved everybody. And so this was an insight I had, first of all, that you give yourself some love and then you can naturally, it moves to love of others. But the main thing, not the main thing, but one of the main things I learned is that public speaking anxiety is a shame disorder, not an anxiety disorder. And that self-compassion could actually address the shame without even knowing it was a shame problem. And so then the question is, how does that work? And the way it worked for me is that it was a kind of having a loving person there who had a very kind and supportive voice that was actually becoming stronger than the inner voice of criticism and blame and so forth. So I'm a psychologist, right? And so I was just hugely interested, first of all, that I could have, you know, gone through 20 years of professional practice with this problem and not seen it. That was really interesting to me. And then I thought, well, what is it that I'm not seeing in my clients? And what does self-compassion bring to the table in terms of shame? And so what self-compassion brings to the table in terms of shame, in my view, is it allows us to, there are two ways of getting self-esteem. One is through contingent social support, in other words, what people think about us. And the other, which is way more portable, is by being kind to ourselves when we suffer. So for example, if I fail and I feel really bad about myself, but I'm entirely dependent on what others think, then I need to become perhaps delusional about how good I am, and I may need even to bully other people, but I need to kind of adjust myself on the social pecking order so that I feel better. This is really painful for everyone, and it's not effective because we're not the best in the world everywhere we go. But if we have within us the capacity to love ourselves and be kind to ourselves when things go wrong, or particularly when we fail, in other words, when the sense of self is challenged, if we can be kind to ourselves and love ourselves, that becomes like a portable source of self-esteem. And so when we think about self-criticism in a clinical context, you know, most forms of emotional disorders, most emotional psychological disorders have some element of self-criticism in them, like anxiety, like you know, like you're screwed, you'll never manage. Depression, you know, who do you think you are? And basically, self-criticism is a common theme through most forms of psychological distress. And at the heart of self-criticism is an attack on the self. And that's what shame is. Shame is an attack on the self. So when I started to look at psychotherapy through the lens of self-compassion and shame, I began to see this in a way that I had never seen it before because I had never seen it in myself. And what I realized is that we actually have an antidote to shame. And the antidote to shame is the practice of self-compassion. And we don't even need to talk about shame. You know, Brene Brown talks about worthiness as sort of a nice way of talking about, or unworthiness is a nice way of talking about shame. We don't even need to talk about shame, although it's helpful if a person can. But what we need to do, if we would like to live more free, shame-free, is to give ourselves compassion. And I think in psychotherapy, we've been doing this instinctively. We've been holding our patients in a kind of compassionate, safe, loving embrace, a safe holding environment. But what happens when they leave this session, you know? how do they hold themselves? How long does it take for what we do as therapists to wear off so that they can do this for themselves? So the great contribution, I think, of self-compassion into psychotherapy, and particularly working with self-attacking or self-criticism or shame, is that we can build this resource between sessions in a way that we become more resilient. And when we are more emotionally resilient, all those things that I mentioned before come into play.
So how would you encapsulate, why is shame important to target? How does it operate and what does it interfere with?
So there are different kinds of shame. You could say good shame and bad shame. There's adaptive shame and toxic shame. Adaptive shame it's a little more like what we think about guilt. Guilt means I did something wrong. Shame means I am wrong. And so adaptive shame is more like I did something wrong. I feel bad about myself. In other words, it's an attack on the self. But I can correct that. And so that's adaptive shame. We need to feel shame when we've, transgressed, the rights or the well-being of others.
That's sort of like regret.
It's like regret, but it has an attack on the self. Adaptive shame has an attack on the self, or at least a more sort of transient attack on the self, which allows us actually to function. So basically, adaptive shame increases our functioning, whereas maladaptive shame does precisely the opposite. Maladaptive shame, in answer to your question, Alex, kind of hollows us out. It makes us incapable of functioning because shame is kind of a precursor for dissociation. We're really not present. When we're ashamed, we try not to be in our bodies. We'll drink a lot, or we'll dissociate, or we'll go to movies. We'll, all the time. We'll do things not to be ourselves. And when we're not in our bodies and not ourselves and not with ourselves, we actually can't see what's going on and we can't do anything about it. So maladaptive shame or toxic shame basically hollows out the self that is the one who needs to do something, function in the world. So what self-compassion does is it can actually move us from maladaptive shame to adaptive shame, or from toxic shame to adaptive shame by reconstituting the self. In other words, in the midst of shame, if we could say, oh, I'm feeling so ashamed, and be kind to ourselves, we actually reconstitute. And then we begin to be able to do something about what's bothering us. And that's precisely what happened to me with the whole public speaking anxiety situation.
So it sounds like the adaptive shame would lead you to maybe have a different perspective on the same situation, or might cause you to change your behavior or grow from the experience. Or if you feel you've made a mistake, you might try to make amends or something like that. Or
Precisely. You're in the game. Whereas with toxic shame, you're not in the game.
right,
You're kind of off somewhere to the side, hoping it's all going to blow over.
right, feeling awful about yourself and trying to forget about that feeling somehow.
Exactly. So, if the three components of self-compassion are mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness, the opposite of those things are, instead of mindfulness, we have kind of rumination. In other words, we get stuck in our heads. The opposite of common humanity is isolation. And the opposite of kindness, self-kindness, is self-criticism. So literally, the opposite of self-compassion sounds a lot like shame, which is that we are ruminative, isolated, and self-critical,
Mm-hmm.
So even from the definition, we could see that self-compassion is an antidote to this state, which rendered us not only miserable, but also way less functional.
So for people who find themselves, like at this moment, realizing that they need help to heal from shame, what would you recommend? The short protocol: soften, soothe, allow?
So how do we work with shame from a self-compassion point of view, for example? Yeah. So people can see this exercise, soften, soothe, allow, which is You can see it on my website or the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion website. And this is kind of mindfulness-based, but also compassion-based approach to working with any difficult emotion. And what's kind of cool about it is that historically we've often tried to work with difficult emotions cognitively, like what are the thoughts associated with it, and then changing those thoughts. But what we're actually discovering is that since emotions have a mental and a physical component, that actually the emotions are more easily regulated actually through the body, particularly really difficult emotions like, related to trauma, which includes shame. So our thoughts are so fast, it's hard to chase them around. But if you can find in your body where, for example, the emotion of shame is located, and it's often, well, it can be anywhere in the body. It could be a sense of emptiness, a sort of hollowness in the head, or constriction in the throat, or kind of constriction in the chest, or hollowness in the chest or the belly. If we can find where shame manifests in our bodies in a moment of shame, that actually becomes workable. And one way we work it, the way we work it with it in the soften, soothe, allow exercise is first we soften that part of the body, which means, imagining that, there's a warm compress or towel, or, the way muscles soften with heat, like in a warm bath. So that's softening. So that's actually physical compassion. Soothing, you can put a hand over that part of your body, gently rub it, or you can talk to yourself in a kind way in a moment of shame, like, oh, I'm so sorry you're feeling that. That's shame, that's difficult. I know that. We can talk to ourselves in the way we would talk to somebody else who was going through the same thing. And allowing then means to also create a lot of space. So soften, soothe, allow refers to physical compassion, softening, emotional compassion, soothing, and allowing is mental compassion. So that's a foundation. And you can practice soften, soothe, allow for shame, as I just described. However, there's also an additional aspects to working with shame, which we apply in the Mindful Self-Compassion training program, which we call the 3 paradoxes or 3 insights about shame, which come from the 3 components of self-compassion. And those 3 insights are astonishing. And the next book that I'm writing, I'm actually contracted to write it, is basically on how to apply these 3 insights to shame. And when we do this, shame loses its grip. Actually, shame, well, just looks completely different. What happens with shame is when we peel back the curtain of shame, we see a few things. And the first thing we see about shame through the eyes of compassion is, number one, that it feels blameworthy, horrifying, but it's actually an innocent emotion. This is a remarkable insight, and I could say more about that later. The second is that it's very isolating. In other words, in a moment of shame, we just want to hide. But actually, shame is a universal emotion, and it connects us. Even the function of shame is to make the tribe stick together. And the third insight or paradox is that shame feels old and all-encompassing. It feels like who we are fundamentally. It usually reflects a negative core belief about ourselves, but it's actually temporary and is only a burden that only a part of us carries. So these 3 insights, that it's innocent, universal, temporary, and partial, are radically transformative when we wrap our head around them. But the most important one is that shame is an innocent emotion. And it's innocent because it comes from the wish to be loved. And if we didn't wish to be loved, we wouldn't feel shame. Shame is the thought that there's something wrong with me that will render me unlovable. And when we can connect with this core motivation, which we've had since birth, that we wish to be loved, actually the reactivity and the intensity of shame begins to subside just with that insight. But we have, and we know that this is true. We know that we wish to be loved just about all the time, but we have forgotten. And we've forgotten because we've been hurt. So part of the journey of self-compassion is to return to a very clear awareness where we can wake up in the morning and say, just as all beings wish to be loved, so do I wish to be loved. To be unembarrassed about this, unashamed of this. To know that when we look in other people's eyes, they too wish to be loved. Imagine what our day would be like if everybody we met, we could see behind the veil the wish to be loved. We wouldn't feel so alone. We wouldn't feel so frightened. And personally, we would be inoculated against so much unnecessary suffering that arises out of shame.
When you were talking about the first part about shame being innocent, I had a flash of thinking of little children, or even like I had a dog growing up, and sometimes you see what looks like shame in the dog, or you see it in children, and just sort of connecting to that simple innocence of wanting to be loved, and having a moment where maybe you're afraid you're not, or you're not lovable. It's as simple as can be.
And it starts so early, I've been reading some of the scholarly literature on shame. And, most people say actually that shame arises first with the age 2.5 to 3, because at that point we develop a sense of ourselves as a social being. And then we do have the capacity to imagine that other people are imagining negative things about us. So you might say real shame probably starts at 2.5 to 3. However, there are precursors to shame that some theorists say even by 6 months of age, even earlier, that when a child is really, really expecting something like a smile from its mother and it doesn't get it, if you watch the physical, the body of an infant, it'll just kind of collapse, like, oh, so there may not be a whole lot of self there, but there is the sense of a kind of collapse, a kind of psychosocial, physical collapse. And this is, in a very simple way, what adult shame is like. It's just like, there's like, it takes a while to kind of reconstitute, And so it does appear that this is really something fundamental, but more fundamental than when we don't get loved back is the need to be loved, because no infant can survive even a day unless somebody's going to feed it, clothe it, touch it, do all kinds of things. And infants can't do anything. So you might say that with the first breath of an infant, their first task or their first wish is love me, because if you don't love me, I cannot survive. So therefore we say the wish to be loved starts with the first breath, but we've forgotten because we've been hurt. And when we forget, it comes at great peril, which is when we're not in touch with that basic need. Then when it doesn't happen, we're just completely mystified and confused and overwrought. But when we know that we wish to be loved, then we can also, even in a what happens is we get to a very innocent place within ourselves, and we can actually, from that place, give ourselves the kindness that we need. What's ironic is, so many people say, okay, when can you start to teach self-compassion? The fact of the matter is that young children, they're all self-compassionate. But as soon as the world starts doing a job on them, like disappointing them and not loving them, then they stop being as loving to themselves. So when we can travel back to, or at least connect with that fundamental wish to be loved, self-compassion springs naturally and shame loses its grip.
How does shame become toxic? Is it related to attachment?
Yes. I mean, there are many reasons for toxic shame. I think you put your finger on it, Alex. One of the most common is critical household or abuse or neglect. There are other reasons. One is cultural oppression, discrimination, bias, microaggressions throughout a lifetime. All this has a corrosive effect. There's intergenerational shame. Shame is even genetic. We haven't measured shame genetically, but we've measured non-shame genetically. We know neurologically and genetically what a psychopath looks like, which is the opposite, no shame, So there are lots of reasons for shame. We don't want to say it's all upbringing, but it is safe to say that the cultural messages, either the subculture of our family or the general culture, that they are first outside and then inside. It's internalized, And when that external language becomes an internal language and it's self-attacking, that's shame.
Yeah, it seems like as you were talking, I was thinking about being, again, not just your upbringing, but also the culture around you. And it's such a hyper individualistic culture that, for many of us being able to admit to ourselves that we want to be loved or something, or that we need to be loved and lovable and interdependent in the world with other people really goes against a lot of the messaging that we get from our education and our broader culture.
Yeah, you're so right, Kate. And when I've done workshops on this subject, people sort of see what it would be like to connect with the idea that just like all beings wish to be loved, so do I wish to be loved, which they did when they were working on this matter of soften, soothe, allow for shame, to connect with that. I would say 20% of people in the room said that I feel ashamed needing to be loved. In other words, they heard messages like, who do you think you are? What makes you so special?
You just want attention, maybe something like that.
Yeah, exactly. You just want attention. And it's kind of sad because immediately you think about the parent that probably didn't get the love they needed, that they would say this kind of thing,
Yeah.
So when a parent can see in the child the wish to be loved, when we can see it in our friends, our loved ones, so much gets clear. I mean, what we're doing becomes so clear. I mean, in the language of nonviolent communication, that inevitably, anger and a lot of misbehavior is a tragic expression of an unmet need. And what is the most fundamental need? It's the wish to be loved.
Mm-hmm.
Shame is a tragic expression of an unmet need. But when we don't know the need, then shame can get a grip on us.
You mentioned, it sounds like you've been meditating for a very long time in your life, and some of your earlier insights in transcendental meditation and through your travels, have really informed your career. I can see the Bhakti yogi, in your lifetime of work and compassion. I mean, it feels like it's very connected. I'm just wondering if you'd be willing to share a little bit about your own kind of meditation or mindfulness practice, these days. What does that look like for you?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I'm always glad when somebody asks me that in an interview, because then it inspires me to practice more because I don't want to be a fraud, So I do try to practice every day for a half hour or something, and also during the day, anytime there's a pause, to bring in some sort of mindfulness or self-compassion practice. In terms of my own meditative practice, I usually start, I don't know if this is too granular for what you're asking for, but
no, granular is good.
Okay. I usually start by just sitting and feeling the gentle rhythm of my breath, allowing myself to be internally rocked and caressed by my own breathing, which is a kind of compassionate way of practicing breath meditation. And after a while, the mind becomes still, the heart starts to smile, and then I open to whatever living beings will appear in my mind. Could be Trump, could be my wife, could be anything. And I send some loving wishes to each and every being that appears in my mind. And When I get kind of lost and distracted, i.e., the mind starts to wander, then I feel my body again, my own body, offer myself some kindness, and then open again to the next living being that appears in my mind. And then at the end, I offer well-being to everyone. And then I open my eyes. And so that's how the day begins. And it's a way of orienting or tuning the heart. But starting with oneself, that's what I've learned, that when our own hearts are at peace and feel loved, then we will bring peace into the world and will love others. So that's how I practice. And then during the day, I just, I more or less continue that practice, kind of a loving kindness practice. It's not quite as formulaic as it used to be. In other words, I don't necessarily have language at the tip of my tongue, but it's more an inclination of heart. But sometimes there's words when needed, either for myself or others.
So it sounds like the majority of your time sitting is using the loving kindness practice. That's kind of the object of your focus. So if you find your mind is busy or wandering or whatever, you sort of bring it back, center on the breath, and then settle back into a loving kindness kind of practice. Is that?
Well, it depends how much time I have.
Okay.
The breath part, I usually need at least 20 minutes. Mm-hmm. For that. It's almost like that's how long it takes for the mind to settle and for the heart to open. 20 minutes. So if I only have 20 minutes, that's all I do.
I see. Mm-hmm.
But when that has happened and then there's space for others, then I start to practice for myself and others in that way. Mm-hmm. So it's a matter of time. How much time?
Yeah, it does seem like it just takes a certain amount of time to kind of stabilize and settle into being with the breath. Yeah.
But it's a really beautiful thing. I just love going through the day, loving people. It's such a beautiful thing, In other words, it's a happy life. The only impediment is when we forget. Or if we ever get the idea we're supposed to love others more than ourselves, Mm-hmm. That's really a mistake. We must nourish ourselves, first or simultaneously with, or it just doesn't work. We can't give water if the bucket is empty, right? So that to have the courage, to have permission as well as a practice for caring for ourselves in this way, I think is essential for caring for others. We don't usually give ourselves permission.
Is there anything over the years that has helped you develop a more consistent practice or kind of be able to come back to this practice on a at least somewhat daily basis? Because I know many people wrestle with just being able to develop that simple routine.
Yeah, I think there are quite a number of things. The one I just mentioned was if I'm in the public eye and people like you ask me this question, then I feel that it creates a kind of a supportive context for practice. It doesn't feel oppressive or demanding. It feels like, oh, thanks. Thank you for asking. Thank you for reminding me. So I do think some kind of community or being in an environment where this actually comes up, mm-hmm. Not just about how far down your email list are you,
Right.
But I think the most important thing, Kate, is that to practice, we have to enjoy it. We must enjoy it. It has to be self-reinforcing. It cannot be an obligation. Cannot be a demand. We have, work is what we do for extrinsic reasons. Play is what we do for intrinsic reasons. It has to be like play. In other words, it has to be delightful in its own right. And that means that we need to figure out how to practice in a way that is pleasurable. Mm-hmm. Now, it doesn't have to be pleasurable all the time, but it must be pleasurable, or or we just can't do it. Every fiber in our body is going to want to do something else, and we'll find a way of doing something else. So it has to be pleasurable. So in my case, to be rocked and caressed by the breathing and to give up the sense of self and just become the breathing is pure joy. And so I like to do it. So it has to be pleasurable. The other thing is it has to be easy. So if somebody feels they need to sit in some sort of rigid way and they're in pain, that's not easy. Or if somebody feels it has to be a half an hour or even 20 minutes and you only have 10 minutes, that's not easy.
Mm-hmm.
And if somebody thinks that, you know, they need to be punctual about this at a certain time in one's routine, then it's, you know, it just has to be easy. The threshold, what you might say, the activation threshold of the practice has to be low. So it has to be pleasurable, it has to be easy, and then the third component, because it's not always pleasurable or easy, is it has to be meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, when it's over, even if it wasn't easy, you can say, oh, that was interesting. Oh, I learned something. And I can say that happens every 2 or 3 days. I learn something about meditation from meditating
Mm-hmm.
that informs my life and teaching and so forth. So those, you know, besides having some supportive community, and supportive community could be even things like reading magazines that are on the same topic, or, you know, watching YouTube videos or something. But basically it won't come out of the ether to practice. There needs to be a context, you know.
Right. So pleasurable, easy, meaningful to support you in the times where it's not pleasurable.
Yeah, exactly.
Community, which could be, you know, as simple as just like you're saying, reading books or watching YouTube channels of other people who are thinking about the topic. I think that's really good advice. And I'm really glad that self-compassion has become something that's spoken about so much more now, because I think when I look back at my own meditation practice, I was pretty spotty for a long time. And it wasn't until for myself that I could sit and feel like, you know, whatever happens, I'm okay. Like that I can be nice to myself when I sit. That was the thing that shifted, that helped me be able to have a daily practice. And I think, you know, now people are talking much more about that. But at the time there was a sense of like, oh, right. Like if you're going to be spending 20 to 30 minutes or 10 minutes, however long, with just yourself and your thoughts, you're not going to get too far if you're going to be mean to yourself.
Yeah. Or if it's just an obligation.
Yeah, right. Or if it's just some demand you're, you know, putting onto yourself or something.
Yeah. So many people have said this, that once they learn self-compassion, it's much easier to have a practice.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
People are less likely to say, once they've been practicing self-compassion for a while, oh, it's hard to meditate.
Right, right.
They say this when they don't have self-compassion. The other thing is, Bill and Susan Morgan at the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy, they spent 4 years in a meditation retreat within the last decade. And I asked them, I said, 4 years, and by the way, mostly silent. 4 years that's a long time, you know, for active people. How do you do it? And they said, you just got to be really, really nice to yourself. I thought that said it all, you know. I mean, so in other words, to sit for 20 minutes with ourselves or 4 years with ourselves, how do we do this? What's the secret? You got to be really, really nice to yourself. And the really interesting paradox is, and I discovered this when I first started practicing loving kindness meditation for real, is that when you do this, you become way more mindful. Mm-hmm. You become way more wise. You know, the subtlety of your awareness increases, the breadth of your awareness increases, you know, the depth and the breadth. Basically, to be really nice to yourself is the best thing we can do to ourselves to become more mindful. And again, it's a real paradox, you know.
Yeah, it seems like when you're nice to yourself, you're welcoming of whatever comes up in yourself, and then maybe you welcome more what arises in the world as well.
Precisely. Yeah. Thank you for that.
So self-compassion boosts mindfulness.
Yes.
And I know you write about this in your book, Mindful Path to Self-Compassion. What is your recommendation for for a formal loving kindness sitting meditation for mere mortals?
We're all mere mortals. I think it's really important that people find, so loving kindness meditation mostly uses language, at least that's what we call loving kindness meditation in the West. It doesn't only use language, it also uses, connection and care and kindness and goodwill and so forth. But the technology of it is around language. And many people feel like, oh, so what words should I use or what phrases should I use? And that's a bit of a trap, because if somebody gives you phrases that don't really mean much to you, and they also say you just got to keep practicing and they will mean more to you, it's a pretty high bar, So I think it's really important for people to find language that really speaks to themselves. So people can get on my website and they could actually do an exercise called Finding Your Own Phrases. But the gist of it is to ask yourself, what do I really need? Or what do I really need to hear from others, if possible, every day of my life? This is a very vulnerable and very deep question to ask oneself, but when you know it and you hear it, it will touch you, it will move you. And when we find language that moves us and touches us, in other words, the thing we've been yearning to hear for so long that we haven't heard or we don't hear enough, we can say that to ourselves. And when we say that to ourselves, it has power. And then we also actually want to share it with others or something similar. So the best advice I can give, Alex, is find your own phrases. And there's also a methodology for it that people can do online. Sitting meditation with the breath is much easier, frankly. You can do that easily for hours. Loving kindness meditation can be quite emotionally activating. So I would recommend to people just not to do it more than 10 minutes a day, and maybe 20 minutes if you want. But Alex, I'd say practice some in sitting meditation, but mostly in daily life, particularly when we are in emotionally challenging situations. That's when we need to bring kindness to ourselves and others. And when we do that, then we actually discover the immediate power of the practice, and then we're more motivated to practice formally in sitting meditation.
That's great. And I will put a link to that Finding Your Own Phrases activity in our show notes, because that sounds fantastic and very helpful.
Was there anything else, Chris, you wanted to add?
Oh, no. My goodness, we covered so much. Yeah, it's been really a joy for me.
And if people want to engage with you further, or, how do they find you? Do you have website, courses, books? What should people do next if they love this conversation and want to hear more from you?
So there are quite a few books if you're interested in self-compassion. I think the first book to read would be Kristen Neff's book called Self-Compassion. It introduces the topic. Then the next book might be The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion, which is my book. Both of these books came out. Mine came out in 2009, hers in 2010, but they're still, I think, quite relevant. So if you want to learn about self-compassion and the relationship to mindfulness, I would start with Kristen's book, then my book. And then in the last year, the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook came out. And this is essentially the workbook that goes along with the MSc course, but you don't need to take the course to basically get a good sense of what the 8-week training program is about. And you might say it's also the most gentle way of learning self-compassion, because you could just close the book. And if you're a professional and you want to learn a lot about self-compassion in the last few weeks, a book has come out, a professional textbook on self-compassion, which has a beautiful summary of the research and pedagogy and also the full curriculum of the Mindful Self-Compassion training program. It was written for professionals to integrate into their work, although it's also a resource textbook for mindful self-compassion teachers, people who've taken the teacher training. So that's really It's 450 pages. It took 6 years to write, and it just came out. So professionals might want to get that book. So those are different options. People who are more online, there's lots of stuff online. You could go to YouTube. And if you can go to Kristen Neff's website or my website or the website of the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion, that's probably the best resource yet. centerformsc.org for a ton of information, free downloadable meditations, whatever you're interested in. And pretty soon we're also going to have lots of stuff available on the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy website.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you for your service to human well-being and your career and all the many things that you've done and shared with the world. And thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much.
I really appreciate it, Kate and Alex. Thanks for your service and your work. It's all good. Thank you for this time.
Excellent.
Thanks for listening today. This podcast was brought to you by the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the integration of mindfulness, meditation, and psychotherapy. For more information, visit meditationandpsychotherapy.org